fixed action pattern. What was it called? Is that this is what his model looked like. He's the one who showed that you could get little geese chicks to imprint on whatever they saw first, right? And so there's always shots of him being followed around by little, geese goslings. But anyway, he tried to organize all these things into kind of a model about what starts a behavior. He actually used almost like a toilet. There's action-specific energy, which builds up in terms of a stimulus until it reaches a critical point, and then it gets to a certain point, and different holes in the trough, different behaviors. In other words, what the actual stress on the system is. Now, it's very simple, and obviously he had no real idea about about how the brain actually works in animals or in humans. We still don't know hardly anything. There's a big consortium now working on the brain, but it's going to, it'll be at least 100 years, I would imagine, before there's a working model of how a brain actually works. We'll say reproductive instinct. Fighting. Well, there's chasing, biting, threatening. So the level of the actual act. Mating. There might be a courtship display. It might involve a zigzag dance, then leading a female to the nest, showing the entrance, quivering, and then finally fertilizing the eggs if the female actually lays in the nest. Okay, so these are all, and you can actually see the same sort of thing, obviously, in terms of neurology and how different things in the brain are actually, we receive them, and it basically starts a whole train of things happening that eventually involves hormones and all that stuff. Okay, flight or fright. Fight or flight. Yeah, that's what we do. We either run away or we sit there and we're going to duke it out. Okay, and each level has its own, appetitive behaviors made up of a number of specific FAPs, fixed action patterns. So a lot of behavior, even fixed action patterns, are really kind of complex, and we'll get more into that as we go. Now, comparative psychology was the other approach. And it happened largely in the United States. Instead of looking at a whole bunch of different taxa, like they did in Europe, they usually had just a couple of animal models, really simple. Mice, rats, what else? Later on, like C. elegans, it's a little worm. People do a lot of stuff with that now. But the idea essentially was that, in fact, behaviors are learned. So on this side of the Atlantic, everybody thought behaviors are learned. In fact, the behaviorists, some of them were so extreme that they thought that our brains are like a blank slate, and that if we're taught, we can learn any sort of behavior. And that goes for other animals. And of course, there's a guy named Noam Chomsky who's a logician and a linguist. And he actually, if you take the behaviorist point of view far enough, then you should be able to teach a dog how to talk, right? Because if the brain is a blank slate, well, then there's no reason that you couldn't teach a dog how to talk. And you can't really do that. I mean, dogs are they're actually pretty good, it turns out, that in understanding they can conceptualize things in an abstract way. So they've done some stuff with border collies. They've shown different sorts of objects, let's say a triangle, a circle, a block of wood, different colors, and they'll tell them to go in the other room and get, let's say, a block of wood that's green. But they've never seen a block of wood that's green before. They've seen a block of wood, and they've seen green. And they'll go in the next room, and they'll actually put it all together and bring you back a block of wood. And the same thing goes with parrots. There's a wonderful parrot that died a couple of years ago called Alex. And Alex was, pretty extraordinary. The only, in terms of attention span, though, he had the attention span of like a 2-year-old. So, and as he got older in life, he got more and more cranky. So it's like he would say, okay, enough, or something like that, and that'd be the end of the session. But anyway, he did the same sort of thing. So before this, of course, everybody thought that animals, in fact, didn't even have feelings. You couldn't feel pain. But, that was a very old sort of idea. Because we think we're kind of important and amazing creatures, and we are in certain respects. But it's like other animals from which we're descended, we share traits, right? Including, it looks like, emotional traits. So anyway, comparative psychology. Here. So, there's this classical conditioning. So this was big back then. There was Ivan Pavlov. Dogs salivate at the sight of food. So the signal, I'm going to show you actually a model that's a little bit better later. But the sight of the food signals salivation. And then they attach that visual cue, they attached a sound cue to it. And then, of course, they showed that after some time, after just hearing the bell, the dog actually, it's even before then, the minute the guy comes in the room to do the experiment on the dog starts salivating. Okay? I mean, that's really what it was. Because, why do you think, well, let's see, I'm trying to think. Animals make associations, just like we do. We see something, and we make an association. Let's say about what we're going to wear today, and we look outside, is it going to be hot or cold, whatever, okay? We make all sorts of associations. If some of those associations are learned, and some of them are are instinctual, or a combination of both. So how many people in here are like afraid of snakes? Okay. Now, there was a question, is a fear of snakes actually behavior that's learned, or a fixed action pattern that's inherited? And we obviously, a lot of people have this fear of snakes. It's fairly common. So some folks wondered, okay, is it learned, or do we have some instinctual sense about snakes because they're dangerous? So they've done a lot of stuff with humans, but they've also done stuff with rhesus monkeys, because it turns out a lot of primates go apeshit over the sight of snakes. They lose their minds. So they did this thing where they raised these monkeys in a lab, and they were naive monkeys. They had never seen a snake before. And if you actually showed them a snake, they didn't really react very strongly to it, suggesting that, oh, maybe it's a learned sort of thing. Now, in the wild, you see these rhesus monkeys or macaques, a lot of different primates. They make an association between snakes and danger, and they lose it, right? So then what they did was they set up a video system where a young monkey could actually look at a video screen. And what they were able to do is, in the foreground, they could put anything in there that they wanted. A snake, a flower, a piece of hose, whatever. And then in the background, there was a bunch of monkeys that either didn't do anything or were going crazy. So what they did was they looked at what these young monkeys did. They found out there was a critical period, just like with humans in talking. There's a critical period for actually learning language. In fact, babies and children, young children, are much better at it than most adults. But I've met some adults that they kind of keep that faculty where they can learn new languages pretty easily. Also, if you learn learn another language, usually you're better at learning additional languages as well. So anyway, so what they did was they showed the young monkey, the snake, nothing happened, but then they showed in the background these monkeys all going crazy when there was a snake in front of it on the video. And with that trigger, the young monkeys actually made a connection between, oh, this is a dangerous thing. So it seems like it's a learned behavior, right? Okay. Well, then they put in a flower in the foreground. And then they showed monkeys in the background going crazy. And of course, it was just strictly a learned behavior. You would predict that, well, they're going to learn how to be afraid of flowers, right? And the young monkey didn't react that way at all. In fact, it looked at the monkeys in the background and thought, what the hell is wrong with them? It's only a flower. So it turns out, and then they did something with like a hose that looked, and monkeys reacted to that as well. So there was obviously components of both going on in a lot of behaviors. But in general, we make associations all the time, and that's what conditioning is really all about. And we make that, sometimes we make the darndest associations. Especially for things that we don't, let's say, understand. Like in the past it was lightning and thunder. Where did that come from? And there were all these different reasons that people came up for why there's lightning and thunder. Back around the time of Benjamin Franklin, remember him, he's the one who had the lightning rod. It was thought that God used lightning to kill people who were bad. And then Benjamin Franklin came along, had invented a lightning rod. And right around this time, there was a huge, or a little bit after, there was a huge earthquake. And one of the big preachers in Philadelphia at that time said, this is all because of Benjamin Franklin. God, he can't use, obviously he can't use lightning anymore, so he's got to use something else, which was a big earthquake, which was, a little less specific to an individual person. You'd think if God was really all that good, he would forget about all that stuff, heart attack, and that's the end of it, but I guess it doesn't quite work that way. Okay, so let's see. Okay, this was a problem box to measure the learning ability of animals. Animal would be placed inside the box and would have to learn how to operate an escape mechanism. And then they would measure how long it actually took. An intellect. The general law is that when in a certain situation an animal acts so that pleasure results, that act is selected from all those performed and associated with that situation, so that when the situation recurs, that act will be more likely to follow than it was before. So the intellectual evolution of race consists of an increase in the number of delicacy, complexity, permanence, and speed of formation of such associations. Oh, they're talking about, this was back when it was thought, that different races were more highly evolved than others. In other words, Europeans were at the highest and everybody else was up below that. Obviously, they were just racist bastards, that's all. Okay, so this was back in 1911. So the big guy in behaviorism was a guy named Skinner. He actually used his own Skinner box on his children. He made a big Skinner box. Because he thought, well, he's a behaviorist, and he thought actually that we have a blank slate. And I guess if you bring your children up a certain way, they'll act exactly how you want them to, and that'll be the end of it. I don't know how he got that idea, because anybody who's ever been around children, you just know that what's one of the first words that little children learn? Huh? No. No. Right. Exactly. So obviously, but this is what they did. So they provide a small food reward, patterns of behavior that are rewarded tend to increase in frequency, and so you can actually measure learning. And animals get better and better at it until they, usually there's an asymptotic curve where they get to a certain point and they really don't get any better after that. So it assumes, of course, this is an assumption that it made. They never tested this assumption properly, by the way, that the basic principles of learning are the same in all animals. Now, like Darwin, behaviorists believe that the minds of humans and animals were similar in kind and differed only in complexity, which is true to a certain extent. Obviously, rats and humans were both mammals, and we show a lot of the same cognitive processes as each other. Not entirely, obviously. We don't have rats reading Shakespeare or something like that. But of course, there's things that rats can do that we can't. Yeah?
Did you believe that they can also that they were made to carry out a different function? That perhaps, different, but one is not more or less complex than the other, but serves a different function?
Yeah, I think at first they didn't. They thought humans are more advanced than other animals. Okay, but then later on, now of course we know that people in general have the similar cognitive abilities, but there are differences. There's been this IQ tests, and it's been shown, of course, that in the past, lower socioeconomic people usually do worse on those. And there was also this whole thing about race, and in Australia they used them. They showed that Aborigines in general didn't do well on these IQ tests as people did. But it turns out Aborigines living like they used to as hunter-gatherers, they actually had an incredible facility for spatial memory. And so they also did a spatial cognition test. And they actually did show, in fact, that Aborigines were much better at navigating than, let's say, Europeans. However, they didn't really. Was there a genetic basis for that because of natural selection over the last 40,000 years, or was it because they grew up in that environment and were just better at it? Okay, but there were certainly differences, and they've seen that sort of spatial ability, there's quite a bit of variation in humans as well, yeah.
Yeah, I think I kind of remember that. Like, they give a certain illusion test, and they're able to try to
Exactly.
figure out the illusion, and they said that it might have to do with how our societies are built, that our society has a lot of corners,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't see their society in that, and so
Oh,
that was kind of like their estimation that our society is
Yeah.
just built a certain way
yeah, that's the
that
hypothesis.
altered our perception.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, in fact, there's a lot of thoughts about, does the choice of words that are found in different languages actually affect how people think? So that's kind of where it's gone at this point. So, physiological psychology kind of looks at exactly what it says, the physiology of the brain. Back in the 50s and 60s, they didn't know anything hardly at all. We know a lot more, but we still don't know hardly anything. But we certainly know what the effects of hormones are on certain cognitive functions or in certain behaviors. So this is, in the 30s, this is what some of the behaviorists actually thought. Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. That'd be a neat trick. Obviously, it doesn't work that way. Who in here is really good with math? There's got to be someone in here. Okay, you. Anybody else? Okay. Now, I'm not. I've gone through calculus. I understand conceptually, but in words, what calculus is all about. But I don't have a natural aptitude for math like I've met some people. And in fact, there's also a correlation between math skill and a lot of time music. But people are born with that. And it seems that no amount of learning can really ever change that. We know from child prodigies and things, I mean, there are some people that are just extraordinary with it. They're usually doing physics or they're just pure mathematics or something, or they're doing, music but then there's other things that I can do. In fact, they did a cognitive test on me at one point, not too long ago, and they thought I had a stroke because my spatial abilities, and that are a lot of times tied in with mathematics, it turns out, were so poor at the low end of the spectrum that they thought, oh, so they did an MRI and nothing showed up. But I could have told them that I've always had a deficit there. I knew I had a deficit mainly because compared to what other people could do, but there was definitely a difference. So there's a difference among people, what certain people have aptitudes for and others don't. Language ability is a good one. So anyway, this is what was thought back then. So you can go ahead and go over this yourself, but if a behavior appears to be rigid, then is it always innate? So these parasitic flies that lay eggs into flower moth larvae, does it mean that a preference for the flower moth larva is innate? Or do they actually learn? Is there any learning whatsoever? So it might be you could do an experiment on this. You have a moth, and you put larvae or the eggs in, let's say, a flower moth, and then you do it in some other kind of moth, let's say. Now, when that fly matures and reproduces sexually, will they lay eggs in a flower moth, or in what they were actually laid in. Maybe some other different kind of species or moth or a fly or something like that. So when researchers looked at parasitic fly larvae of other species, not a flower moth, these individuals, when adults, chose the other moth larvae as well to lay eggs on. They did it on both. So it looked like this preference is learned but not innate. But they've also done, there's a lot of these antagonistic interactions between plants and animals. Or animals and animals, or animals and plants, where let's say flies lay larvae in certain kinds of fruit. And a lot of times they're very specific. Even it's innate. In some respects it's completely innate. In others there's a bit of learning that's involved here. Okay? So with these flies, now it looked like the preference for the flower moth larvae is innate. It was not innate, it was actually learned. But there might have been, you would suspect that there might have been underlying this, perhaps a propensity, more of a natural propensity to lay in flower moths, regardless of where they were laid. But I'm not sure exactly what the study showed. So when you're looking at things like innate, you have to really think about them. Even though they may seem like they're innate, they actually may be a learning component that goes with it. So this is, let's see, nature, nurture. Anybody, tell me about nature, nurture. Anybody? I'm going to pick someone. So, you've heard about the nature-nurture controversy? Okay, what is it about? It's okay. Okay, listen, you're probably a little nervous. Okay. Where are you most comfortable with? What location? Okay, just make believe that you're at home right now. You probably wouldn't invite me over, but let's say your parents are there to, make sure everything's safe. Okay, so you feel totally safe, and nobody else in this room is actually here. We're just going to have a little conversation. Okay, these people behind you and in front of you, they don't exist. It's just you and me. Keep watching, getting sleep, you're getting sleep. Okay, so nature.
So things that you were born with versus the things that you kind of grew up with your environment.
So nature, would be basically genetics and that sort of thing, and nurture, the environmental influence. There's still this, people still do this. It's amazing. They still look at this and think there's actually a controversy. As we know, every behavior or every trait is actually a combination of both. I'll give you an example. Zebrafish, they do a lot of studies on zebrafish physiology to learn about physiology in general in invertebrates. And they were looking at how hearts actually develop. And they thought, okay, do we have like specific genes that, you have this and you're going to automatically develop a heart, or is there any sort of the environment that actually goes into producing a heart, a functional heart? And they actually showed that when a zebrafish, now you would say, okay, the zebrafish heart is kind of set in stone. It looks like it's completely nature, right? Unless there's some mutation or something like that. Well, it turns out the heart develops, the zebrafish actually start developing a circulatory system before there's even a heart. And they have these small vessels, and in a certain place there's these shear forces in terms of the blood flowing by. And depending on the shear forces of, it actually causes the heart to develop properly. So the shear forces actually affect the genes that turn on and turn off. And over time, the way the shear force is moving through, initially this vein, but then becomes more and more complex over time, it's actually both going on. So even, it seems like a heart is like completely nature, but it's not. It actually, a heart develops properly in the proper cellular environment. You just have to think about the environment in the correct way. They've done stuff with, taking animals up, embryos up into space and the effect of gravity. And in some cases, without gravity, things don't develop normally. Okay? Now, you would think, okay, developing heart is completely innate, or it's completely biologically determined. But obviously, they did this experiment where they changed. They put a kind of a little bead, and it changed the way the heart was shaped because it interrupted or displaced the flow. Now, learning a language, we would think, oh, that's completely learned, right? But we all know that, in fact, it's not. I mean, we have an innate facility for language, especially at certain times in development. In fact, we have parts of the region of the brain that's, there's a speech center that's dedicated almost entirely to speech. If it gets damaged, people can relearn language, but it usually gets shunted off into another part of the brain. But there's both going on. Obviously, dogs can't talk, right? So it turns out for behavior, the same sort of thing happens. There's usually components that are, we would call nature, and there's components that are, we would call nurture. Okay? And sometimes it's not actually even genetic in terms of different alleles. It's actually gene regulation. So our understanding of how phenotype arises has changed a lot in the last couple of years. So the modern view, of course, is that there's kind of an interaction between the animal and the environment in terms of behavior. And the environment can be at many different scales. So for humans, what environmental influences probably have the strongest effect on our lives? Anybody in here? Family? Social interactions, right?
I think environment has a lot to do with it.
Well, that's what I'm saying. What kind of a social environment? Oh, you're saying sort of like the general environment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like where
So
you grew up or.
okay. So what usually kills people? What affects survival the most?
Disease.
Disease is one. Anything else?
Peer pressure.
Huh?
Peer pressure.
Peer pressure.
Poverty.
School.
We're really, if you think about it, we're really attuned to other people. We're a social species, and in fact, if we actually think about it, if we're not really good at reading other people, now some people are much better at it than others, we have to be aware of our social environment. I mean, a social environment affects everything that we do, not only necessarily how other people treat us in terms of survival, but in terms of reproduction as well, right? Why are you attracted to certain people and not to others? How do you make yourself more attractive to others? Now, these are really important things, whether you do it unconsciously or not. The social environment is probably the strongest effect on people compared to anything else, especially in the Western world, we don't die of the same things that we used to die from. Like infectious diseases, this doesn't happen. We die from things that come along generally later in life, where selection is really weak in general. So, in terms of humans and behavior, the social environment, and that's what I mean by looking at environment in terms of different scales in different ways. It's not just a physical environment, this lab, but it's also the social environment, right? Now, so for example, why did you choose to sit in the seats when you first came to class that you chose? Or let's say it's a big class with 100 people. Some people sit up close. Some people sit in the back. Some people sit next to other people who they're attracted to. There's all these kinds of things that actually affect habitat use in human beings. Okay. So anyway, this interaction thing, every time we think about, now we can do selection gradients and all that, and we can show that in some cases, like with twin studies, we can actually show that there are certain things that are more innate, that you're grown with. That you, so identical twins that have been separated at birth, they show all kinds of really strange things happening. You know, they both, let's say, there was a guy, they were separated at birth. One grew up in Nazi Germany, the other in, I think, Great Britain. It turns out they were Jewish. Now, they were reunited. And it turns out they had many of the same tastes. Remember, they grew up in really different environments. They had many of the same tastes, and they also actually married women with the same name. Now, you could say, oh, that's just a coincidence, but it's been shown it's happened before as well. Okay. So, of course, experimental chicks were raised in the dark and force-fed, no experience in begging from parents. At the age when control chicks rotate their head to grasp the parent's bill, experimental chicks did not do so, thus head rotation is affected by experience. So, in this case, it was both. Both was going on. There's, they have to be exposed at a certain time frame, but there's also a learning component. I mean, you can see it with young animals, and they're usually gangly and then they're not very, very good at, let's say, running around, or young humans, obviously. And they get better and better with time. That's all learning. But underlying all that is obviously some physiology there. Okay, so problems with there was this early learning theory. Now, we're almost done. One thing that a lot of this learning stuff has been learned in terms of looking at birdsong, which we're going to cover later on. So, actually learning how to sing properly for a young bird, a young male bird, and for a female, learning what proper birdsong is really important. And there's a critical period, just like there is for language. In fact, for animals that do mimicry, there's a lot of these things that happen at specific times. So you have to be careful in terms of an inference that you can make about innate behavior versus actually a conditioned response. There's usually both components going on at the same time. We'll see when we go to the coast, a lot of gulls have this spot on their bill, and it's a stimuli for the chicks to actually peck at the bill, and then the adults regurgitate food for the chicks. But, and there's certainly an innate response involved here. But they tend to get better and better at it. Okay. So I forget what this experiment is. Well, they showed an association, but our learning predisposition for certain things, but not for others. Parent-offspring recognition is better developed in group-living colonial bank swallows, as you would expect, versus ones that are solitary. Because if you're colonial, you have to go back to the right place. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, that's it. Okay, good.